Hello and welcome. This month we're going to be talking about US imperialism and colonialism. But first, I would like to begin with acknowledging the tremendous theft that occurred of Turtle Island and suggesting the repair of a land tax. I live here in what is called the Bay Area on Ohlone territory. I give to the Segurite Land Trust what is called in that language a shumi. You may live in a different place, but I promise there is a way that you can pay a land tax wherever you are. If you're also living on land that was stolen from indigenous people and want to contribute to the repair for that. I do want to highlight a little bit of that history, especially getting into US imperialism and colonialism. You can see here the erosion of indigenous land since 1492, and that projects into the future the question of how much land will be rematriated, how much land will continue to be stolen. The United States has accumulated an incredible amount of wealth and power from genociding hundreds of tribal nations on Turtle Island, and land is one of the foundational components of that accumulation. At least some of those red areas, which are native reservations, actually came out of prisoner of war camps. That was the official title for some of them. And paying a land tax now will contribute to making land back a reality. I do have something of a soft spot for maps. I find maps and signs really interesting in how they communicate to us, so I do want to take a moment on the topic of maps to bring more mindfulness to which maps we're using for what purposes. Overwhelmingly, most of the time that you see a map here in the United States at least, you're looking at the Mercator projection. The Mercator projection is a map that keeps the latitudes and longitudes at right angles in square boxes. And you will see that the Mercator projection is the one that starts out with all of these countries really big. But that is because the Mercator projection stretches out space closer to the poles. It is a map originally meant for sailors. It preserves the shape of the coastlines, but there is no need for it to be in every classroom of every school in this country. What the globe looks like matters, and the fact that most of us have internalized an incorrect view of the world matters. You can see here that the dead giveaway for whether you're looking at the Mercator projection is whether Greenland is the size of Africa, as it is depicted in the Mercator projection, or whether it's roughly the size of Algeria, as it is actually. And the fact that the entire continent of Africa can fit Canada, the United States, China, and Russia all into it should indicate something about the amazing amount of diversity that can be found on the continent of Africa. There are different kinds of projections. This is one of my favorites. It's the Winkle projection. No flat map is going to be perfect. You can get real nerdy and into the weeds with this, but the Mercator projection is just not necessary. Now, another thing that's important about maps is that if you've ever seen a map of the United States, it has probably been the contiguous 48 with a little insert with Alaska and Hawaii on to the side. It very likely does not even show Puerto Rico or the US Virgin Islands or Guam or American Samoa, which are all territories of the United States that are populated by humans living on those islands. Not to mention the variety of uninhabited islands that the US occupies for other reasons, whether that's strategic military locations or resources including guano. Yes, that's a thing. But this is yet another reason why maps are important. This next map here is an inexhaustive map of the countries that the United States has participated in regime change or election interference. There is a color code to this that's more detailed than I want to get into right now, but this is just regime change and election interference. We're going to spend a bulk of the time talking about military interventions. And this here is a map of countries where the US government has admitted to launching military interventions. And again, it is important to remember that the actual territory of the United States was all conquered via military intervention. Over 500 tribal nations were overthrown. And you can see here, this is in fact most countries on the planet. And again, just the countries that the United States has admitted to. And I'm going to pose the question to you, do you know the number and names of the countries that the United States is currently actively bombing? I encourage you to take a moment to pause the video and actually reflect on this question. How many countries can you name? I'm going to show y'all a video right now that was published in October of 2016. Some of the details have changed, but we'll get to that after the video.
In most countries, the citizens know who they're at war with. But here in the United States, it's sometimes a little difficult to keep track of who we're bombing at any given moment.
Do you know how many countries the U.S. is currently bombing?
I have no idea.
No.
A few.
40 in between 50.
I think 1 or 2.
I don't know. My favorite color is purple.
In fact, we're currently bombing 7 different countries. Now, let's start with the easy one. If you've been watching the presidential debates, you know that ISIS is a major concern to our candidates.
ISIS.
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 You brag that you have sexually assaulted women.
ISIS.
ISIS is located in Iraq and Syria, so we're dropping bombs on both those countries. Syria is a real humanitarian catastrophe, where literally half of the country's 22 million people have been either killed or displaced. The Syrian war is a complicated clusterfuck with at least 4 different factions fighting each other. Our goals there are to knock out ISIS, but also to knock out the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, but they're fighting each other, so sometimes it's a little difficult to know who's bombing whom. The fact that we're bombing Iraq should come as no surprise. As The Onion points out, we've been bombing them off and on for about 25 years now. The other country that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise is Afghanistan. We invaded them way back in 2001 in response to the 9/11 attacks. We've been fighting there for 15 years now, and there's no end in sight. It is officially the longest war in American history. And as part of our war in Afghanistan, we're also bombing Pakistan. That's because sometimes the Taliban and Al-Qaeda hide out in the northern part of that country along the Afghan border. Now is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. We're also bombing a country called Yemen. Now, the war in Yemen is incredibly complex, but basically, we're conducting our own drone strikes there to target Al-Qaeda camps, but we're also supporting Saudi Arabia's larger attack on a group of rebels known as the Houthis. To be clear, the situation in Yemen is also a massive humanitarian disaster. According to the UN, 80% of the Yemeni population is in desperate need of humanitarian aid to meet even its most basic needs. There is evidence that the Saudis are deliberately targeting civilians. According to The Guardian, more than 1/3 of all Saudi-led air raids on Yemen have hit civilian sites, such as school buildings, hospitals, markets, mosques, and economic infrastructure. Just the other day, there was a US-backed Saudi-led airstrike on a funeral that killed 140 people and wounded another 525. According to the Associated Press, in the aftermath of the strike, hundreds of body parts were found strewn in and outside the hall. Rescuers collected them in sacks. The attack turned the funeral into a lake of blood. Another country we're bombing is Libya. Now, you may remember we bombed them way back in 2011 to get rid of their dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. But after we got rid of Gaddafi, the country descended into chaos and ISIS was able to move in. So now we're bombing them because we don't like the replacement for the guy that we didn't like. And finally, the 7th country we're currently bombing is Somalia. Back in March, an American drone killed 150 people there. Now, immediately, the Obama administration put out a statement that claimed that every one of those 150 people was a dangerous terrorist from Al-Shabaab, a group that has carried out several attacks within Somalia. No one has independently verified that all 150 people killed were in fact terrorists. The only evidence we do have is from that one statement, from the government that killed them. And that brings up another important point. Who exactly does the US government consider an enemy combatant in the endless global war on terror? The New York Times reports that the Obama administration considers all military-age males in a strike zone as combatants, unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. Well, that's convenient. Any dude standing near a place where we decide to bomb is an enemy of the United States. If you really think about it, they're not wrong. So just to recap, since we launched the war on terror after September 11, 2001, we've spent $4 trillion and 1.3 million people have been killed in our combat zones all around the world. So Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, and Somalia are the 7 countries we are currently dropping bombs at. Oh, and just as a reminder, the number of wars currently authorized by our Congress, 0.
So at the time, that was 7 countries, and then the US has also bombed Nigeria in 2017, as well as Palestine in 2022. And it's true that whenever Israel bombs Palestine, that is with US support, but most of the time the US does not directly bomb Palestine, but the US has participated in directly bombing Palestine sometimes. So that makes 9 countries since 2016. Also worth noting is the number of bombs, which is actually a little tricky to measure because some measures are of the bombs dropped and some measures are of the strikes. And one strike can drop multiple bombs. But to give an idea of the scale, if we stick to modern history, which is to say post 9/11, Bush dropped an average of 10,000 bombs per year during his presidency. Obama roughly doubled that to an average of 20,000. And Trump peaked at doubling that with over 40,000 bombs in a year, including the largest non-nuclear bomb on Afghanistan. Now, after that peak, Trump's bomb rate did drop, and Biden has continued that trend, but the United States is still dropping thousands of bombs on 8 countries every year. And there are sources in the slides for all of this. Also worth noting is that Obama is the only Nobel Peace Prize recipient to bomb another Nobel Peace Prize recipient when the United States bombed a Doctors Without Borders hospital. And yes, it is ridiculous that Trump pulled the United States out of the UN Human Rights Council. And it is also more ridiculous that the United States was ever on that council to begin with. And the rest of this presentation will explain that even more. And I do want to take a pause here and say that this is one common source of frustration that leftists have with liberals, in that so often liberals neglect the international injustice that the US is committing every day. So I invite you to take a moment to reflect. How aware of this are you? Are you bringing this up in conversations with other people? And how much can you lean into that? Moving from bombs, we're going to talk about weapons in general. Biological weapons were the first type of weapon to be banned at the level of a global treaty. You can see here that happened in 2 stages, with the Geneva Protocol prohibiting the use of them in warfare, and the Biological Weapons Convention banning the use, development, and production. And the United States did manage to sign on to that treaty in a prompt way before it took effect. Chemical weapons, however, the United States did not agree to the treaty banning them until 1997, when the treaty was made effective by the number of countries who had ratified it. So once the chemical weapons ban was going to be put into effect, then the United States decided to sign on, which triggered a commitment to safely dispose of all of its chemical weapons that it was storing by 2007, which the United States has still not done. And you can see here that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons estimates that there were 2 to 5 million deaths in the Vietnam War from chemical weapons. That's primarily going to be coming from dioxin or Agent Orange dropped by the United States. Meanwhile, on the Department of Defense's own website, on their page about the history of the United States' use of chemical weapons, they credit Nixon with renouncing the first use of lethal or incapacitating chemical weapons, and nowhere on this page is any mention of the country of Vietnam. But we'll be talking about propaganda even more later. The next type of weapon to be nearly completely banned by a global treaty is landmines. And I actually remember growing up, learning about the efforts to ban and dismantle landmines in junior high, being told that it was a very serious issue, only to learn later as an adult that the United States has still not committed itself to banning landmines in its own use. The Biden administration explains that they still want to be able to use them in Korea and the DMZ. The next type of weapon nearly banned by a global treaty is cluster bombs. And the United States has simply not signed the treaty banning cluster bombs. Which finally brings us to the most devastating, nuclear bombs. When it comes to nuclear weapons, the United States and Russia each have about 45% of the world's supply. And I imagine you'll have seen a lot of the media fear-mongering around North Korea developing a few nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the United States has over 5,000 of them. Now, does it matter that Russia also has over 5,000 nuclear weapons? Yes, it matters. Even just a few of these weapons is enough to basically end all life on Earth. And for some context, in addition to the nuclear weapons inside the United States, the US also stores nuclear weapons in the NATO countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. You'll note that those are US nuclear bombs much closer to the border of Russia than any of Russia's nuclear weapons are to us. I would invite you to imagine what might happen if Russia were to try to store nuclear weapons of its own closer to the US border, but we don't need to imagine that. That was the US-Cuba Missile Crisis, and the United States almost started World War III because of it. In fact, the US has 750 foreign military bases in over 80 countries around the world, which is roughly 95% of all foreign military bases on the planet. You can see a lot of these are in Europe, the Middle East, and along the Pacific coast of Asia. This is global domination. You can see here this part of the graph details the number of bases and the number of troops, the top 3 countries being the same, Japan, Germany, and South Korea. Again, this is global domination. And it costs a lot of money. If we compare military budgets across the world, we see that the United States, with its over $800 billion budget, is not only more than twice that of China, which is number 2, but it's more than the next 10 countries combined, and in fact is more than all global military spending but the top 5 countries. Every country on Earth spends closer to Costa Rica's $0 of military budget than to the United States' $800 billion. This final thing I want to show you on the topic of military spending and propaganda is that even in this graph, which comes from Visual Capitalist, which should tell you something about its perspective, in this graph we can clearly see the United States dominating in terms of military budget. But even this graph manages to make a US ally, Saudi Arabia, look more restrained, and 2 countries more antagonist to the US look more aggressive, as though China increasing its military spending has any comparison to US spending. But again, we'll get to more propaganda later. Now let's talk about US federal spending. So one thing that's really important to note about federal spending is that at the federal level, spending is actually not funded by taxes. In fact, when you write a check to pay for your federal taxes and your bank account goes down by however much, there is no bank account that goes up by that amount. That money is figuratively incinerated. This is because the federal government is a monetary producer and does not need to tax you to get money. It simply spends money into existence. Now, it's important to note that local governments actually are funded by tax dollars, so your city and state, but the federal government is not funded by taxes. The slides here will link to Stephanie Kelton's TED Talk. She's a really great speaker on this. You can see her other stuff, and she has an excellent book on it. But modern monetary theory is the concept that explains this. All that is to say that this graphic is a little misleading. Where your 2021 tax dollar went, it didn't go anywhere. Where it went is oblivion. It's gone. But the actual graphic portion I find helpful, so I'm still going to use it. So you can see most federal spending goes to Medicare and unemployment. The military actually comes in third at 11% of the total federal spending. But what's important to know about that is that Social Security, unemployment, and Medicare are all mandated by law. So Congress can't just get together and decide to cut that without a change to the law. Those things are called mandatory spending. The rest of it, which is called discretionary spending, Congress gets together every year and they talk about where they want to put what money toward what. Also worth noting is that Medicare and Social Security both came with massive movements and crises behind them, which is what it took to put those into law. Whereas without those movements, when Congress is left to its own devices, they keep increasing the military spending and trying to defund everything else. So as a percentage of discretionary spending, what is officially military spending basically takes up half already. But then you have veterans benefits, which is also basically military spending. And some of what is earmarked as education actually goes toward military because the junior ROTC programs are in part funded by the education budget. When a school hosts a junior ROTC program, they share in the costs with the military. And the education they get is even more nationalist propaganda than the usual US education. And then remember that things like the science budget, some of that is actually going to weapons and military research. And then even some foreign aid, which is already less than 1%, is just a modern day version of blankets with smallpox. Food aid, for example, has been known to be timed with the local harvests of the country that it's being sent to in order to put local farmers out of business, which disrupts that country's food sovereignty and then renders that country even more dependent on US aid, which makes them more susceptible to US pressure. And the countries that are wise to this and decline, the US government will then turn to the public and say, look at this, what kind of monster rejects free aid? Remember that, we're going to come back to that. But first, we talked a little bit about the human cost. We talked a little bit about the financial cost. Now I want to just touch on the environmental cost. The US military is one of the biggest polluters on the planet. To give you an idea, it puts out more greenhouse gases than twice the number of cars on the road in the country. If the US military-industrial complex itself were a country, it would be the 47th largest polluter in the world. You can see here just the military puts out more greenhouse gases than Egypt, Spain, Nigeria, and more. And that just the United States military puts out more greenhouse gases per person than all of China. But I'm sure you've seen the headlines about how China is really bad for global warming. And also, it's your fault if you're not using high-efficiency light bulbs. Now, we've been talking a lot about the military, which is obviously a big part of US imperialism, but I do want to bring up some of the less overt ways that the US forces other countries into its interests. So I'm going to show this video and then we'll come back.
We economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire, and it's basically a secret empire. We do it many ways, but principally, we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. The money never actually goes to the country. It goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country that help a few very wealthy people, but don't benefit the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or have cars to drive on the highways, and yet they're left holding a huge debt that they can't repay. So we go back at some point and say, you know, you can't pay your debts. Give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Vote with us on the next critical UN vote. Allow us to build a military base in your backyard. Something along these lines. And when we fail, the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders. And if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then we send in the military. I don't think the failure is capitalism. I think it's a specific kind of capitalism that we've developed. We've created what I consider a mutant, viral form of capitalism. And this mutant form of capitalism, which I think is really a predatory form of capitalism, has created an extremely unstable, unsustainable, unjust, and very, very dangerous world. I've met a lot of terrorists. I've interviewed them for books. I've never met one who wanted to be a terrorist. They're desperate people. If we want to get rid of terrorism, we must get rid of the root causes, that cancer that is destroying our whole system. Because I think it's really important that we understand today we cannot have homeland security unless we understand that the whole planet is our homeland.
So the person you just heard speaking is John Perkins. And before I explain more about who he is, I just want to say I don't agree with everything he said in that video. I'm thinking of the part where he distinguishes between capitalism and predatory capitalism. However innocent capitalism tries to start out, it runs away with itself and becomes predatory. It's inherent to the system. Anyway, John Perkins describes himself as a former economic hitman, by which he means that it was his job to go to other countries and perform an economic analysis of what would happen if they lent money to those countries. But his real job was to inflate the numbers so it looked to the other countries like they would be able to pay back those loans much more easily than it would actually be, which put them in financial debt to the United States. And once they were indebted to the United States, that's when the US could say, okay, we'll tell you what, give us a discount on your oil and we can work out some of the details of the debt. Mind you, they would always identify countries they wanted stuff from first and then lend money to those countries. It was always with the intention of trying to get something from them. If this is sounding to you like it's what the United States is accusing China of doing to countries in Africa, that's because the politics of power is always a politics of projection. Every accusation is a confession. And remember, if those countries say no to this pressure, that's when the CIA comes in to attempt a coup. John Perkins calls them jackals in the video and in the book. But it's only when the CIA fails that the US attempts a full-scale ground invasion and military war. So the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman will go into more detail, but that's the basic gist. There are two other books I want to highlight. One is actually a comic book called Operation Ajax, named after the CIA operation, which really became the model for modern-day coups. This is when the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, among many other things that he was doing for his people, tried to nationalize a pipeline that at the time Britain was still profiting off of. And Britain turned to the United States to say, will you help us deal with this problem? And the United States, yes, we'll help, but of course we want a cut of the profits. And so the US incited political unrest throughout the country. They paid protesters. They portrayed Mossadegh as a monster. And they ultimately replaced a progressive, democratically elected head of state with a right-wing dictatorial monarch known as the Shah, or Reza Pahlavi. And it was this coup that the US has now modeled in its operations since then, the big difference nowadays being that the United States employs more private businesses to do some of this work, so that the government can put its hands up and say, this isn't us doing it, this is just corporate greed or business as usual. So maybe that gives you a little bit of an idea of why Iran has such a problem with the United States. So that was in 1953. And in 1954, the United States basically did the same thing with Guatemala with the help of Edward Bernays, all because Edward Bernays, the propagandist who invented the modern-day field of public relations, was hired by the United Fruit Company, what is today Chiquita Banana, to help them stop Guatemala from nationalizing the banana plantations. Same plan of anti-communist propaganda, same plan of sowing political unrest, same plan of backing a right-wing coup and instilling a right-wing dictator. There's a long, long history of this, only some of which is detailed in an excellent book called Killing Hope by William Bloom, and I strongly recommend that if you ever travel outside of the country, you read the corresponding chapter of the book. With 56 chapters in the book, it's almost certain that whatever country you're visiting, there's a chapter about how the United States has disrupted that country in some way. We're nearing the end here, and I just want to give a little bit about at least one of the countries that the US likes to antagonize, partly as an exercise in truth-telling, and partly as an exercise for you to reflect on the amount of US propaganda you're being inundated with. Now, I choose Cuba because I have been there, I happen to know a little bit about it, and I think it's a really great example of resisting US imperialism. So here's a map of Cuba, and you'll notice those two bright red regions in Guantanamo, that of the US military base Guantanamo Bay, which the United States is illegally occupying in order to commit the war crimes of torture. It's also important to know that before the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was ruled by a US-backed right-wing dictator named Batista, and things were so bad for a variety of reasons, just one of which is that they were under racial apartheid. And it was the 26th of July movement led by Fidel Castro that managed to overthrow that apartheid in 1959, which is before the US overturned its own apartheid that we know as Jim Crow. So going over that, Cuba overthrew a US-backed apartheid, has faced numerous coup attempts from the US, devastating sanctions and embargoes, and an illegal occupation, and they have still managed to achieve near zero houselessness with incredibly reduced rental costs, near 100% literacy with completely free education, a greater life expectancy than the US has, that's also more equitable, which is to say that there's less discrepancy between the black life expectancy and the white life expectancy in Cuba than there is here in the US, all with free healthcare. Their number one export by far is sending medical staff around the world, which actually brings in a revenue of $11 billion to the Cuban government. And in fact, they regularly offer free help to countries facing natural disasters, including the US. In fact, when Hurricane Katrina happened, Castro offered free healthcare aid, and Bush declined that help. Now, I want to remind you of the question that the US poses whenever someone declines the food aid that it offers. What kind of monster rejects free help for his people? And even after sending out all those medical staff, Cuba still has a higher rate of medical staff per capita in its own country than the US has. And finally, not Cuba's number one import, but significant on that list, is actually healthcare tourism, which is when people travel to Cuba to get healthcare, which includes people from the US. All of this, and Biden has still called Cuba a failed state, and the Biden administration still has Cuba on the US state sponsors of terrorism list. And when the State Department representative was asked about this, he literally could not provide any evidence for Cuba's sponsorship of terrorism. One critique you might be familiar with of Cuba that I want to address is the question of putting queer people in concentration camps. What actually happened is that Cuba has mandatory national service, and if you decline to serve in the military itself, there are work camps that you can serve in. And queer people were working in those camps, partly because of the overwhelming queer phobia in the military. And when hearing about the amount of queer phobia that they were still facing, Castro actually went undercover himself as a worker in the camp. And after experiencing the discrimination there, he expressed remorse and made efforts towards systemic change. And today, Cuba has just recently passed one of the most progressive bills of any country in the world for family, women, and trans and queer care. Whereas the US was founded on what's called a double genocide. I put this in quotations because it refers to black people and native people as though it's just two peoples, but actually together that's hundreds of tribal nations. And not only has the US not given reparations to those people, it's actually worse. The US actually gave reparations to enslavers for the loss of their property. And if we generously refer to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as overturning legal apartheid, then the US has been under legal apartheid for 3/4 of its existence. 0.7% of the total population is currently incarcerated, which may not sound like a lot, but that's almost 1 in 100 people, and that's 20% of the world's total incarcerated population. About 95% of those incarcerations are without trial, which is to say that those people were incarcerated based on plea deals. This country has 582,000 unhoused people, roughly 0.175% of the population. Meanwhile, with 15 million vacant homes in the country, that's 27 empty houses for every unhoused individual person, and roughly 45,000 people die every year from a lack of health care. Now that number is from a 2009 study, which is pre-Obamacare, but it was hard to find recent numbers because studies on poor people lack funding, and the US calls Cuba a failed state. But then recapping what we've learned about US foreign relations, the US drops thousands of bombs on 8 countries every year, has 95% of all foreign military bases, half of all nuclear weapons, and is the only country to drop not 1 but 2 on another country in an act of war. Its military budget is more than the next top 10 countries, or also greater than all but the top 5, and regularly violates international law with war and torture. And I ask you, who is the state sponsor of terror in this situation? And I answer, the United States is the terror. So that's Cuba and the US. But I invite all those watching this to post comments below any data they want to offer with sources on Venezuela, Iran, China, Russia, the USSR, and Palestine, as well as any other country you want. I emphasize those because those are the ones that the US often villainizes. And yes, this is absolutely a way of crowdsourcing my research. It takes a lot of work to make these videos. Please share them. But there's one final point that I want to make before we close out. But in order to make that point, I need to set up a little bit of a nerdy context. As usual, the nerdy context is dialectical materialism, just a framework that property relations tend to be dominant in influencing social relations, and that it's property relations that determine what kind of social relations will thrive. And so the important point I want to emphasize is that in the context of property relations where the US is engaging in a scale of harm that we've seen in this video, the kind of social relations that will thrive are racism and nationalism and all the other oppressions. This is why I emphasize it's important to reflect on both the interpersonal and the institutional, because our individual relationships matter and the systems that we live in also matter. So yes, it's important to take responsibility, and it is also important to organize and make grand change. And this raises the question, what do we do? And the always answer to that question is agitate, educate, organize. We'll start with educate. We can always learn more. If we're ever stuck, just pick something new and try to learn how it relates to something we're already familiar with. Whenever Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael was asked in his presentations, what can I do? He would always give the same answer, study. And what's really important is have these conversations with people, learn in community with others. So much good work comes from book clubs, and they don't have to be books. You can read articles or listen to podcasts or watch videos and discuss with people. Now, if you're going to go in the direction of organizing, there's a lot more at play here, but the general pattern is sabotage opponents, win over neutrals, and increase camaraderie among comrades. I'll be making another video at some point that goes into more depth on actions and organizing, but I offer this for now, more links in the slides. And finally, I want to leave y'all with some reflection questions. As usual, the tree of contemplative practices, because maybe you do your best reflection in stillness, maybe you do it in movement, maybe you do it in creative expression or conversations. Because we don't just learn from experiences, we learn from reflecting on the experience, as was said by radical educator John Dewey. So the first reflection question is, how does this connect to my life and work? I promise you it does in some way. And the next reflection question is, what can I personally do in the short, medium, and long term? Finally, I leave y'all with some resources. There's the as always stuff in the lower left corner to give you more of a leftist foundation to work from. But then as for the stuff specific to imperialism and colonialism, some really great resources here. I strongly recommend the book People's History of Empire, which is a comic book adaptation of the relevant parts of Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States. A few more videos and podcasts. Empire Files is an excellent podcast/TV show that looks at the US through the lens of empire. And then the second page of resources goes a little more into the US media propaganda relationship. And I strongly recommend that article, How Many Bombs, especially the graph at the end there that shows the number of bombs dropped on each country every year, more or less for the past 20 years, basically since 2001. Thank you so much for listening and for your attention and your care. This one means a lot to me. I do ask that you share it. We really need more attention on this issue. Thank you, comrades. Love, gratitude, and solidarity.